Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on where you folks are joining from. Welcome to Wharton's AI Horizons webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about the use of LLMs in learning. And we have a very interesting talk as well as a conversation coming up with David Rothschild, who's from joining us from Microsoft Research. I will introduce David in a moment, but first I just want to take a couple minutes to introduce the center as well as this series of talks, and then segue right into this session. So first of all, I'm Kartik Hosanagar. I'm a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm also the faculty director of AI at Wharton, which is our center focused on AI's applications in business and society. And we do a number of things at the center. One of that is to both support and share cutting edge research on AI's, as far as AI's application in business and society are concerned. So we have supported a number of research projects by colleagues, not only at Wharton, but at other places. We've organized a number of research conferences as well, which bring in practitioners as well as academics and help trade insights where academics can learn from the kinds of questions that practitioners are dealing with and the kinds of techniques and technologies they're using. And at the same time, practitioners can learn from the research that's coming out from some of the best AI research groups at universities. So more about those conferences in a moment. Outside of that, I'll mention I also have an AI newsletter, which is hosanagar.substack.com, where I discuss a number of issues related to AI and its relevance to business and society. And today's session is actually related to a series of conferences we organized. My colleague Stefano Puntoni and I recently organized a generative AI and business workshop in San Francisco in September. We organized one last year as well. And in addition to that, my colleagues Sunny Tambe and Bob Myers organized an AI and the Future of Work conference, which was focused on AI's impact on the workplace. And we had a number of excellent research talks there by several leading academics and researchers. And we've been bringing some of the best talks here into this series to try and share some of those insights with you all. So we have a number of other talks coming up on human AI collaboration, adoption of AI at firms, one coming up pretty soon with Matt Bean from USC, followed by one with Neil Thompson at MIT. But today's session is the one that's focused on AI and education. And in particular, David is going to help explore a question which is on a lot of people's minds. Is AI ultimately going to be a tool we lean on a lot to get our work done, but hurts our learning because we just rely on the tool to do the work for us, for example, do the homework for us? Or is AI ultimately going to be a great teaching aid or a learning aid that can help improve learning outcomes? David, as I mentioned, is a researcher at Microsoft Research, where he studies a number of important themes related to prediction markets, polling, social media, more recently, AI and generative AI's implications. He's also a PhD from the Wharton School, having got a PhD in applied economics at Wharton. So with that, I'll turn it over to David to share his presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me today. And also thank you much for Wharton and the University of Pennsylvania and their leadership in so much of this interesting research and part of the series. And so here's I'm just listing a couple of papers which I'll talk about during the course of this talk, and happy to make available afterwards. As the introduction said, I'm going to start by talking about and mainly talk about these questions involving education, but I want to kind of frame it first in a larger question, which is AI as a technology, as it is introduced into various tools in our lives, something that we want and think of as something that is going to be augmenting humans, making humans more productive, making humans do things better, or is it going to be replacing? And I think this is one of the kind of key underlying questions that's driving a lot of concern and research. In general, we like to think of it as we know that we can use AI to make better decisions, to be more productive, and we have that as a goal. And whether or not that is doing it by taking humans out of the picture and doing the math for us, or writing a presentation for us, or whether or not it is empowering us to do that better, to be more productive, improving our own capabilities. And so I want to kind of frame a lot of this discussion in these high-end goals of making better decisions, being more productive, but to focus on the ways in which systems can do so by increasing the way that we reason, increasing and improving our own capabilities. We like to kind of utilize, and this is in joint work with Jake Hoffman and Daniel Goldstein, this concept of steroids, sneakers, coach. The idea that technology can either really just kind of replace us. Steroids, they pop in, they increase performance, but do so by de-skilling us, by making us worse, by kind of like sneakers, they can be there to kind of just make us go faster when we're doing things, but not really affect our core underlying abilities. Or they could be teaching us, and they could be making us better as they make us better, so that even when you would take away this technology, you would still be better off. An example I like to throw at people to kind of show the malleability of this is spell check. You can imagine a spell check system in which every time you spelled something wrong, it just corrects for you and doesn't even tell you. It gets used to your misspellings so that your misspellings work. And so it actually makes you a worse speller, but really allows you to move fast, but you're going to be terrible without it. You can imagine something similar to our current systems, which show you a squiggly line, give you some answers. They really kind of help you along your way pretty quickly, and they don't necessarily hurt or help you, or at least do so marginally. But you can also imagine a coach version. You can imagine tweaking this type of AI just a little bit in order to make you better by forcing you to rewrite the words. Maybe that slows you down. There's a trade-off, but maybe it makes you better off if that's the trade-off you want. And so in short, the choices that we make in designing and deploying AI tools can have substantial impact on the effects it has on productivity, but also the underlying thing that we care about in many ways as well, the humans who are engineering this work, who are making things happen. And what's going to happen is that over time, as various new tools are introduced, there's going to be shifting norms that are going to emerge about what we utilize these things for, how they affect our skilling and de-skilling, and what we accept and don't accept. And then these things are going to change. They're going to evolve over time. And if we look back on many disruptions beforehand, from the calculator, this question about whether or not we're going to need to be able to do this type of math or not, all the way back in time to all sorts of other ways in which things that our ancestors knew how to do, we no longer do, but we're okay with that. And one of the really critical things that research comes into beyond how we engineer these products and how we engineer these tools is continuous measurement and understanding, because without creating baselines, without cataloging what our norms are and how they are shifting, we're really not going to ever understand the impact on our lives and how various types of tools have affected us. And I like to kind of point to something like, say, totally different, social media. We have a lot of questions now about how social media has affected our friendships, how it's affected the way in which we have connections in the world. But the problem is a lot of stuff that we're trying to measure are things that we don't have great baselines for because we weren't as concerned about them when these types of things were introduced. And of course, with this disruption, we're ready for it. And so let's turn to education specifically. The peril. Will LLMs destroy education? Of course, we have all of these results out there. The LLMs can do really well in these types of tests, that we're worried that students may just use the LLMs, and this can lead to just terrible outcomes because you have the LLM do your homework for you, you don't learn anything. It's a pretty straightforward story. But on the other hand, we also have the promise. The promise that LLMs can be not just providing the answers, but providing detailed explanations, and that as a result, everyone has their own individual tutor. So we worry so much about the access, especially in lower socioeconomic locations, to individual education. This could be the thing that solves it, right? Everyone has their own teacher, and that teacher is teaching right to your problems. So how do we start addressing this? Well, we start addressing this with tons of different laboratory experiments. And I'm going to kind of note here, just there's a virtuous cycle in a lot of the work that I'll talk about, which is that we do a bunch of laboratory experiments to try to get in detailed understanding of how things may be affecting people. We look at large-scale observational data, things that are on the field, and see what we can learn from that. And that then gives us hints, oh, now we need to go back in and then take another detailed look and see how these things are affecting people. And this is kind of the virtuous cycle of research that I'll talk about today. So I want to talk about two studies in math. Study number one, which I'm going to talk about, involved us taking a bunch of people and we gave them some math questions. We worked through some practice on it. We distracted them. We came back later and we had them take tests. But what were we testing in this case? Number one is that we were providing some of our participants the ability to practice and take the practice questions before we gave them the answers, and other people, we just gave them the answers. And then the answers either came just the answer itself, or stock LLM answers. It's just, you just plugged in the LLM, got whatever the LLM is providing out, or kind of customized, more tutor type of answers that are meant to really optimize educational learning. And in this case, it was all multiple choice, and the questions are SATs. So practice, where there's a couple of variations, distraction, and then what we really care about is how people do on the test then. So everyone comes back, everyone takes the exact same test, bunch of different SAT questions, we see how they did. And one way to kind of think about this is that in many ways, the pre-LLM kind of optimized scenario is somebody does their homework and then they get the answers back, right? So bottom left-hand corner, they try first, answers come in, and they just get the answers. You don't necessarily get an explanation when you have your homework handed back and just says check, right? In an LLM-based world, we are thinking, okay, so maybe a lot of people will just get the answers first, but they'll get a nice explanation from it. So those are the top two on the right side. Or maybe they'll actually do what is probably the best, which is still try to do their homework first, then plug it into an LLM and get an explanation on top of it, kind of a win-win scenario. Interface, pretty straightforward, plug in some questions. The key thing to understand is that, so you may just get a plain answer back, or you may get a kind of a stock LLM type of answer, or you can get a more tutory answer, which kind of works you through in more depth and really helps kind of explain what's going on. All right, so what kind of results do we see when we do things like this? Well, the first thing to point out here is what you're seeing here is the practice phase on the left, test phase on the right. Test phase is what we care about, but not surprisingly, when in the light blue, when people see the answer first, they mainly get the practice right because we've given them the answer, so that makes sense. In the red, they try first. It's really tough, and you see pretty dramatic improvements. People do much better in the test than they do in the practice. So it's a good validation. But let's hone in on parts of the outcome that really matters. This is the test. So you take the two right. This is our stock LLM and our customized LLM. How are people doing on the test compared to people who just get the answer? Well, LLM explanations positively impact learning relative to seeing the correct answer. So all across the board, getting the LLM explanation seems like a pretty good thing compared to just getting the answer. But of course, there are substantial benefits to actually trying first, to attempting to answer the question, then getting the LLM explanation, which is circled up here, versus below it, which are people who just saw the LLM explanation and were not forced to attempt the practice question. And there's strong evidence that suggests that the customized does a little better than the stock versions, although it's more directional. And this is a kind of indication of how much kind of making it to more of a tutor can be more beneficial or not compared to the stock LLM. And finally, and I think in many ways most interesting to us, is that the biggest worry that you kind of see in the way the worry is kind of laid out is that people who just start using the LLMs are going to be worse off than the people who use the kind of old-fashioned thing, which is to try the answer and then get the answer from it, to try to answer the question and get an answer from it. And what we're seeing is that there's even a hint that people in the LLM explanation group who did not try to do their homework, but just got a nice explanation, did even slightly better than the people who tried to do their homework and then just got an answer. Statistically, it's not statistically significantly different, but what's very clear is that in this scenario, people are definitely not worse. So the fear situation that people who don't try to do the homework, get an explanation, and then go and do the test will get crushed in the test compared to people who do the old-fashioned doing the homework and then just get an answer. That is not panning out in this scenario. Nice kind of reality check for us is we also then check to see what methods people used, and we can see that people who were given a stock explanation use that method. We can see how we can use, sorry, this is the cool stuff. We can use LLMs to check the work of the people who are doing our tests about LLMs, and the LLM then tells us what method people were utilizing. And you can see that people who were in the stock scenario were using the stock methods that were described, people in the custom scenario were using that, et cetera. And so that was study one, but then we kind of got into a second study here, which everyone's really worried about. Hey, in that first study I described, the LLM was correct. And of course, everyone's really worried about the LLM being incorrect. So rather than do the try first thing, we had everyone try first rather than some people just seeing the answers. And then we gave them 3 different sets of answers. We have people who just got the answer, but is correct. People who got the LLM explanation, but there was an arithmetic error in the LLM explanation. And so the LLM actually gives the wrong answer, but gives an explanation. And then the LLM without error. Again, we do some sort of distractors, and again, we provide a test. So again, everyone's trying first, but then there's 3 sets of things they're going to see: either the correct answer, the LLM with an error, or the LLM without an error. All of these questions, by the way, are a little different. We did algebra this time. The answers are open-ended, which we found pretty necessary in the scenario to avoid the kind of noise that comes from just guessing in multiple choice. And we did something to target the audience, since we're using people from an online participant panel rather than students, but we gave a series of pre-tests to see that they had some understanding of algebra, but not too much. And again, the key dependent variable here is, again, going to be unassisted tested problems. And so let me just hone in on the left side, chart A, and this is the kind of the key thing, is that what you see kind of looks linear from just the correct answer to LLMs with error to LLMs without error. And what this means is that the people who saw the LLMs with an error did better in the test phase than people who just saw an answer. So even though the LLM had an error in it, they were doing better than the people who saw the correct answer, but they were doing slightly worse than the people who had LLMs without an error. What does this mean? Well, it's evidence that even though there was an error, people were learning. They were not replicating the error, although some actually did. They were learning the concept, even though there was an arithmetic error that gave a wrong answer. And then we asked a series of self-reported perceptions, and I won't go into details of it, but it's super interesting to see who picked out the error and who didn't, and of course, what they think they learned versus what they did not learn. And a lot of stuff with LLMs is not just even what people are learning, but kind of the perception of how they're feeling that they're learning. And there's a lot more I could talk about that if there's time. We have a ton of other educational studies in the field, including trying to build out taxonomies of where LLMs impact by thinking about which question types and which answer types are most impacted by the use of LLMs. A lot of stuff is not that relevant in one way or the other. Other things, it's extremely useful, and other things, it could be potentially detrimental. There's definitely a realm of question and answer types. And certainly when it comes to errors, this is the case as well. So we've been playing around with conceptual errors, so where the LLM just doesn't really understand the question, versus arithmetic errors, where they get the question, but they make a mistake. And this points to kind of turning some of the stuff we see in the news on its head. It's great and interesting how well LLMs do at tests, but we don't use the LLMs to solve our tests. We're using the LLMs to help us answer homework problems, to help us understand things. And so how they teach is more important than whether or not they make errors in many ways. We've been doing this in math here, but we've also have stuff in the field doing reading comprehension, including a very large study, which will hopefully be able to release soon with a bunch of students. And so before turning us over to the Q&A, I do want to talk about a few other related work that kind of show where this kind of larger body goes. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time on is thinking not just in kind of search and answers for students, but in general. So getting news, getting consumption journeys out of the way. Are you going to buy a new car in this case? And we have a bunch of different studies out this. And again, we're thinking about this error question. How much do errors throw people off? How much do people get so used to the LLMs that error is going to drive them into a bad place? And what we found is that if there are errors in certain scenarios, it can make people make bad decisions, not surprisingly, because once people get used to these answers, they really trust them. And but there's also ways in which beyond just trying to train people that you can help them do better. One is by providing some sort of calibrations. And so we did a bunch of tests where we highlighted numbers in various search scenarios with red if they were low confidence. And I'm not going to describe this chart, but we can just say that on the right side, we learned that by providing these highlights, you are able to completely ameliorate the major concerns that we have of people having overconfident in making poor decisions, because it makes them look for more information. One of the really tricky things, which I like to remind people about LLM-based search versus standard search, is that standard search provides a ton of different options. An LLM-based search generally gives you one natural language answer. And so you don't get to see the cues about what's correct and not correct that comes from seeing multiple answers on the page. And all of this then says, well, how well can we identify the types of errors that happen? How do we know? Can we anticipate? And you'll hear some words pushed around that maybe make sense or maybe don't make sense depending on your background. But the token probabilities is essentially the probability that the model is going to pick the next value, the next word. And token probabilities are super interesting and a kind of key way that we can kind of guess underlying probability. But I want to point to this chart from OpenAI, which is super awesome. On the left side is the calibration of a bunch of stuff on OpenAI, and that happens from the model before they fine tune. And on the right side is the model that they release. And what they are saying, and this is in the release notes for GPT-4, I think. I can't remember. I think it's GPT-4. Yeah. That the stuff that they do to make sure that OpenAI is user-friendly actually crushes a lot of the calibration of these token probabilities. And so we've done a lot to kind of reverse engineer and think through how you can think about errors, whether or not the errors are coming from the prompt or the model itself, or just the way that the output is put on the screen, and how that can help you and us think about ways that tooling can be improved and the way that people can respond to it. And finally, kind completely kind of separately in a sense, but in my mind, very related. If it comes up in the Q&A, I also spend a lot of time thinking about this whole thing, not in the realm of just education and search, but also in the realm of surveys and survey design. And one of the super interesting things there is that people's minds immediately went towards, let's replace respondents. Let's just use LLMs to respond. And that has kind of been pushed aside a lot for practical reasons. And a lot of the work has been moved into thinking about ways in which LLMs can help the researcher augment rather than replace the respondent. And once the kind of realm of research kind of moved in that direction, is actually opened up a lot of really cool initiatives, including a lot more open-ended questions in which the survey design can respond to responses and ask the appropriate questions to get the information they need. And on the analytics side, having the LLM be able to summarize and to explore and create quantifiable and interesting results. And what this has done has made me extremely bullish, actually, on the future of surveys as a place in which we really are kind of pushing towards where augmentation can do amazing things rather than where replacement is causing a lot of fear and anxiety, and justifiably so. And so with that, I'll turn it over to any questions.
Thanks, David. Folks, if you have any questions based on the presentation, feel free to use the chat and post your questions there. And I will pick the questions and read them out. David, I'll kick it off actually with one question I have, and then we can turn to some of the questions posted here. You have two sets of results in your main study. One is the one on essentially what is the LLM explanation doing to learning outcomes. And the second one is sort of also looking at errors in LLM explanations and what that does. So one question I have is, how is this different from, say, having a textbook for prep, where the textbook gives you an answer with an explanation? Is it simply that using a textbook where you have explanations will help improve learning outcomes? Or is an LLM somewhat different? For me, an LLM is about dynamic chatting or maybe personalization and things like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the really interesting parts of kind of being a generalized researcher when it comes to impact of LLMs and productivity and behavioral economics in general is that it then starts bumping up against the very specific and very detailed knowledge that people have in, say, in this case, in the educational domain about the best ways to teach people to learn. And so I definitely don't want to profess, trying to re-engineer the way that we think about general learning skills. And clearly, the question of just explanations in general versus not having explanations, just having answers, I think it's pretty clear that it's been shown and people understand that there's a huge value there in having explanations. And but more to your question is that how is it different then from a textbook into an LLM? Well, yes. So in this scenario, we limited the amount of back and forth possible with the LLM and kind of focus on the explanation. But the LLM is able to do better than what we showed in this experiment when students are able to engage in meaningful back and forth over what they did wrong and learn from that process. But there's two caveats in the experimentation that we've done that I think are key to note. And number one is that we're trying to focus here in the experiments that I've shown on the experiences of people who are not necessarily attempting to learn a lot, but are attempting to just get the answers, right? And so the fear focuses not so much on the eager beavers, who I think would probably be every single person listening to this webinar, who obviously is somebody who spends the time and wants to learn. The fear centers around people who just want the quickest set of homework answers and then to move on to go play baseball or run around or whatever it is, play video games that they want to do. And so ultimately are less likely to provide that back and forth. And then number two, in the experiments that we've done with students in classrooms, we do find that at this point, there's still a lot of wasted energy in the LLM discussions as students are exploring LLMs for maybe some of the first times. A lot of them are in the work we've done, or otherwise are not very skilled in targeting their LLM tutoring experience in an open LLM scenario. On one hand, that argues for more targeted tool sets, ones that are not just tossing it into OpenAI or Bing Chat, but focusing on LLMs that are designed to engage the student in a meaningful tutorial way. But then, and it also begs the questions about how these various tools are going to evolve to best serve the needs of students with various types of baselines and various types of interest in learning. And so, I think these are kind of baseline attempts at understanding one aspect, which is users who are not necessarily out there to learn everything they can, and also utilizing generic tools. But of course, the engagement part really comes into focus as you move towards a tutorial or tutoring scenarios.
Got it. David, do you want to take, one of the questions over here? There's a number posted here, maybe the first one.
Yeah.
And in fact, while you do that, my dog's being particularly loud. I don't know if it's coming through, but I'm going to just manage.
I don't see the questions though. Is there a way which I can?
Okay, why don't I read out Rohit's question, and then I'll come back to the other ones later. So Rohit is asked, is referring to your second study, which focuses on LLM errors, and he brings up that human tutors also have errors all the time.
Okay,
so
now I see the questions,
whether, first of all, do we know whether human tutors are less erroneous than AI tutors? And maybe building on that question, what do we know about how people react to, like, say, human errors versus, say, LLM errors?
Yeah. All right. First of all, I love that question. Thank you, Rohit. So the correct counterfactual is such an important question in academic work that is sometimes missed. And you're correct, right? So the correct counterfactual here, in many ways, we're thinking about would be a textbook, which is highly edited. So if you had the teacher's edition to a textbook and you had the explanation there, there's a really good chance that it is extremely strong. That being said, of course, if you think about humans, teachers, they're going to make mistakes. Arithmetic mistakes, especially, are going to be extremely common in explanations that could be provided for you. And when it comes to more difficult questions, conceptual mistakes, I think, would be pretty standard. And so it is really great to try to think about the right counterfactual, and studying that. We have not kind of laid into that too much because it's a really hard thing to determine. Although for other work that we've done when it comes to understanding the kind of choice set for searching through for commercial for purchases, so in the conversion journey, we have, and you commonly see websites which make assumptions about various types of products. Those errors are out there all the time, and so it is the perfect type of thing to compare it to. Another thing I'd add to that is that we definitely see a lot of the errors that come through from LLMs are highly correlated with the types of errors that exist in the real world, because they are actually sometimes directly derived from that, right? So if they're making some sort of errors, there's a good chance that it's the type of error that you'd experience in other scenarios.
Thanks, David. And in fact, I'll add something here. While it's neither of these are related to specifically AI tutors versus human tutors, of course, we've seen in a number of scenarios where people have run these tests of AI versus human performance accuracy errors across a range of settings. And generally, the results tend to be pretty similar, which is that AI in a lot of settings is able to get work done at a lower error rate than humans. But that human and AI generally do better than AI alone or humans alone. And then in terms of how humans respond to errors, there's a study by my colleagues at Wharton that look at how people respond to errors by algorithms, and that research pretty much shows that people are more forgiving of human errors than AI errors. So generally react negatively to AI errors, even if it turns out humans have the same or higher error rates. So I just wanted to share that. Moving on, a question by Ganesh, which is, could you comment on how faculty might treat this kind of assistant? Would be great to get Karthik's view also on having LLM assistants. Anything on that, David, before, I'm happy to share my thoughts as well, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, so great question. And ultimately, I like to think of this as a really difficult transition period. I really feel for teachers at all levels, because I think that the future is going to be a lot cleaner scenario. And ultimately, I think that it is a matter of shifting what we think of as homework. And one thing that I think is going to be very common is having people do homework, not just by handing in answers, but by doing so in a system that is cataloging all of the steps you take. And so more likely scenario in a couple of years is that you'll see people doing homework in homework systems, in which every prompt and set of responses and work is cataloged, summarized for the teachers, and allows teachers to really see, number one, that humans are actually doing it, and number two, provide them with personalized understanding of not just whether or not people got things right or wrong, but if they understand conceptually what they're doing. And so I think the future is pretty bright, because the worries, a lot of these worries about just like cheating and handing and things will be ameliorated by having people work in systems in which they actually are not just forced to provide proof that they did it, but actually provide so much additional feedback to teachers that they're able to be more effective in both what they do directly with people and the customizing that'll come along with such programs.
Great, thank you. And I'll just add here one quick thought on this in terms of my own experience with use of LLMs in the classroom. One of the challenges that I have in my, at least in my teaching, is that students often ask for, sample problem sets or, some way to prepare for quizzes and exams. And I usually have the material, and my response usually is, hey, you've got the material, just go through it again, and that's your preparation. But I think students feel more comfortable when they've got sample problem sets to try. And a great use case of LLMs for me is, here's the lecture material, generate a bunch of quiz questions for the students, and now they can practice and prep on that, just to make sure that their prep, they kind of walk into the classroom to a quiz or an exam feeling like their prep is consistent with what's needed. And of course, then you have to give all the caveats, such as later you cannot come in and say that the LLM told you this answer is correct, even though in the classroom, my lecture, I had not suggested that. So there are those kinds of limitations of LLM errors that we have to walk the students through. But many use cases in terms of helping students prepare for homeworks, exams, including helping faculty come up with exam questions, quiz questions, come up with question banks, things like that. So many use cases there. Moving on to the next question from Meredith. Again, David, not sure you can read this, but the question is,
oh yeah, I see the questions now. Yeah,
we see the questions. Okay, great. So this I'll read it out for everyone who's attending. So how does this translate to education for adults in the workplace, where you're less likely to have specific answers? Like you're trying to teach salespeople how to sell. That's very different than math question with very clear wrong or right answers.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is where the ability of LMs to make chatbots and training chatbots is just incredibly exciting. Most likely for specific tasks and specific goals, they're not going to be done in generic systems, but ones in which we take large language models, or even maybe even smaller models, and heavily fine tune it towards the situations that people are coming at. And for those of you who don't know what I'm saying, just basically think of the base model as being some model that's just like trained on everything. And then there's all the stuff that you throw on top of it in order to have that model learn about specific tasks, and help essentially improve the model towards use cases that we may care about. And I think immediately towards this question, I think towards some of the general productivity questions have been that have been shown really effective has been customer service agents, especially. So a lot of the early research looked into showing how you could take a bunch of phone calls, plug them into the system, and really improve the ability for customer service agents to get real-time feedback on the engagements that they're having in a chat or phone situation, and help alleviate problems much faster. And I think that, these types of systems are going to start popping up more and more and help train and essentially simulate the type of things that people do in the workforce. And I think will have a huge impact on productivity and knowledge and growth. I think a key question here is going back to the steroid sneakers coach thing that I talked about before, is that what we're seeing mainly as this type of training is heavily beneficial to people who are kind of starting out or are lower skilled and pushing forward, and how it ends up replacing their general knowledge or not, depending on if they're utilizing it in real time or whether or not they are taking that information and going out in the field and using without the crutch. I think is going to be an important question about essentially how this is going to improve skills or essentially become a crutch that could de-skill people.
Great, thanks. Should we move further down?
Sure.
I think it's Samiksha's question on if access to an LLM is given, what's the best way to learn or practice new concepts? Parts of it have been covered, but perhaps maybe you want to tackle it head on.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it is a great question, because one of the things that's popped up a lot is how important is it to train people on prompts and usage, and whether or not this is like a new skill that's going to be incredibly important in the workplace. And of course, it immediately harkens back to the fact that 25 years ago, 30 years ago, being able to Google well, be able to search well was considered a really important tool, a really important skill set, right? And ones that ultimately, with the evolution of both the tool and people, became more commonplace. People learned better and were able to be more effective. And I think that when it comes to prompting and to be able to utilize LLM-based tooling well, being early in is going to give you a good leg up for a while. But then, of course, ultimately, we expect the tooling to improve, and we expect people general knowledge to improve so that things start evening out.
Yeah, David, one nice thing I felt like I learned from your study is, in terms of even LLM uses, don't give access to the LLM use directly to the student before they've had a chance to try it. And so first have them try it, get it wrong, and then have the LLM come in. And so I like that. That's a good takeaway from me.
Absolutely.
Okay. The next question from an anonymous attendee is, given that student confidence in using tools to solve problems is a critical factor in their learning experience, do you have an established scale to measure students' confidence in utilizing LLMs for problem solving?
Look, I think this is a question about evolving norms, and one in which we're going to have to tackle as it evolves, in the sense that we expect people to have certain skills that we need to carry over into our jobs and our life, regardless of what people do. And then there's other types of things that we're going to always be happy that people have LLMs with them as a crutch, and that's going to be perfectly reasonable. And when it comes to problem solving in general, I think it's going to be super interesting as we make decisions in the educational space about what is really important for people to be able to do and not do without the LLMs working through the problem with them, or replacing them, or however we start thinking about it. Personally, I was from the generation that learned how to write essays by filling out note cards and then moving the note cards around and then piling them together and then start typing. And of course, we have evolved to say, okay, that's okay. You can utilize the LLMs, you can utilize the word processing in order to start organizing your thoughts and then move paragraphs around, and et cetera, et cetera. And when it comes to that type of things, we're okay. And of course, one of the key effects of LLMs beyond anything else is generally moving people away from being content creators, from being kind of the first solve on things, to doing more editing type of roles. And so I think a lot of questions in both kind of reading comprehension and learning and problem solving in math will kind of revolve around how we switch our norms and what we accept and need people to be able to do in an offline setting as well as in an online setting. I'm not sure if it was a tricky question, so hopefully I got to what you were looking for.
Yeah, that question did make me pause there for a second. I have one last question, and then I want to make sure there's time for closing remarks from you and from me. So the question I have is, you brought up this concern that LLMs could also just ultimately be misused by students to, for example, not do their homework, or ultimately not learn the way they used to doing, get the answer too fast, and so on. Your study didn't explicitly test for misuse. Is there anything you can say about potential misuse? By the way, there's a number of other questions that have suddenly come in at the last minute too. We'll quickly tackle those in rapid fire fashion.
So about the misuse of LLMs by students. Yeah, so again, in more open-ended scenarios, we've seen students who are utilizing the LLMs in probably not the most productive way for themselves in even being able to do the task. And so there's a huge amount of learning curve that still needs to go towards what types of questions one would ask themselves, both to just answer the questions and to learn. So it's kind of win-win scenarios and getting people up there in those skill things. One answer, or one thing that we see repeatedly, like for example, is in reading comprehension, you see a lot of requests to kind of cliff notes the situation. So you drop words in, you drop paragraphs in, you want to get summaries. Ultimately, when it comes to a lot of tests, you're much better off in trying to get something that's a lot more akin to a translation, trying to get things in plain English, but not to cut corners, not to summarize. And so we're just trying to play around with what types of prompts provide a win-win scenario. And then people who are even trying to skirt will at least do a better job in learning accidentally along the way. And then I do see these questions. I would say the creative tasks are super interesting and important questions. So early research has kind of shown that LLMs could plausibly lead to more homogenization as a lot of creative things start with similar types of prompts. There are ways, again, that people can be encouraged to continue to explore without being kind of put into that funnel, but also ways in which the tools themselves can be for creative tasks dropped to, for instance, have a higher temperature, which means that they just randomize more and throw more things out there, or the tools can otherwise be encouraged to push people in further directions. So I think the initial worry is probably pretty meaningful. And especially, as I said, people transition more from less kind of creative jump starting to more editing, because that's really what happens in all forms of stuff with LLMs, because you're trying to get over that initial hump, the blank page. LLMs are great in starting you off, and that puts you in a more editing role, but that definitely can lead to less creation. And then the anthropomorphization question is super interesting, especially as we look to the future, right? So right now, LLMs are popping up separately in all sorts of different locations and are really kind of built into experiences that we understand. The thing which is going to shift a lot is what happens next, what happens in 5 or 10 years. And it's going to be a lot more bot interactions, a lot more agents, essentially, that you enter, and a lot more centralized is the most likely scenario. So as that happens, you're going to depend on these things and more like you would a human. And this is more like whether or not we're going to end up in the Alexia / Siri type of world, or we're going to end up more in the world we have right now. And I think these are really important questions for how we're going to engage with these types of agents or tools, and ultimately how we think about them.
Did we cover all the questions, David, or let's see? Steve's question, do you see that?
Yeah, and again, I think this is really where my hope is that we move towards homework and work being done in a controlled setting, wherein that really kind of forces students to explore and learn in a way that getting quick answers could be not terrible, but certainly is not optimal, right? And so the hope is that right now you have a series of questions that you ask students. They may drop them one by one into OpenAI's ChatGPT or Bing Copilot or whatever it is. Hopefully the explanations that they get back make it not as bad as if they just got the answers. The hope is in the future, they're going to have to do their homework from start to finish inside of a tutoring type of setting, in which you as the teacher will have degrees of freedom to kind of push them and basically be able to see the full pathway. And that full pathway will be one in which you can first ensure that people are doing the homework, but number two, find new ways to teach people, and number three, get feedback that allows you to personalize as a teacher the learning experience for all your students.
Great. Thanks, David. We have a couple minutes. I think it's time for some closing remarks. Maybe I'll take 30 seconds and just share my thoughts and then give you the final word on this. I shared a comment here in the chat with everyone, which is that ultimately my view is that concerns with LLM are real. I shared a link to a study that shows that fewer students are benefiting from doing their homework. And this is because students now have access to the answers, or an easy way to get the answers from online sources like Google search. So I feel that LLMs will exacerbate that effect and make it easier to get the answers, and therefore herd learning. But at the same time, AI can help. David's study is a good example of a study that proves that. I saw another study that showed that Kenyan entrepreneurs who had access to AI to learn entrepreneurship skills were doing better as entrepreneurs as well. And so there are opportunities as well. And so for me, the question really comes down to, how do you design student AI collaboration? What policies do you use? How do you implement it in practice versus will it always help or will it always hurt? So that's my closing thought. And David, over to you.
I guess my closing thought is that thinking through today's talk, I hadn't thought of it this way. I do sound pretty bullish on the impact of AI in society. And I don't know if it's hope or optimism, because ultimately I think this is happening and there's no way to stop it. And that the best way to kind of approach that then is say, how do we make this a good thing for society? And that there are very small but extremely impactful ways in which tooling and usage norms can make this a positive, and that's what society has to do, because this stuff is happening regardless.
Thank you, David. Thank you all for attending today. You can access David's work online. I've in fact shared a link to his paper on chat, so you can find it there. And we will be also posting the recording through Wharton AI and Analytics, LinkedIn, and on our website as well. So you can continue to follow up with all of us there. So once again, thanks for joining. And there will be many more of these sessions and programs. So please do join us in the future as well. Thank you.